Morning, everybody. Thank you. It's good to be with you this morning. I can tell how long in the tooth I am just by how long that took, that career resume. Over the last few years, being Director of General Operations and Amy being the CEO, we've tried to alternate coming to the conference, and it was Amy's slot this year. But given that she's been elevated to the Interim Permanent Secretary, you've got me for 2 years on the bounce, so apologies. I just wanted to start by just paying my own tribute to Jo Simpson. And I was fortunate enough to see Emma earlier this morning and give her my condolences in person before she headed off home. I knew Jo for a long time, and I was very fond of him. When I was an officer at Leeds in the early 90s, that's when I first met him, and we worked together numerous occasions when he was there on detached duty from Manchester. And later in the North East, when he was at Home House and I was the area manager, I met him a number of occasions then, and he became the area rep. When I was the area manager, I had a lot of dealings with him in his role then. Obviously, over the recent years, I've been in a national role, and so was he as the Deputy General Secretary, so our paths crossed again. I know Jo was held in very high esteem by everybody, really, that he worked with. He was a very committed, decent person. He was very dedicated, knowledgeable about health and safety and its improvement. I do like the idea that in Leeds, the city where I first met him, there will in future be Simpson House. I think that's very fitting. Moving on to what you've been talking about a lot during the course of the conference, being very focused on safety, and how could it be otherwise in light of recent traumatic events. And I do want to mostly reflect on safety with you, but I do want to touch on three other things first, quickly. The Minister has talked a lot about the strategic context for us and about changes that we're seeking to drive through. He's obviously mentioned the capacity situation and yesterday's announcements. The sentencing review should report soon, and then I expect the government to try and move legislation through Parliament quickly to make changes to the sentencing framework, changes that will, in the longer term, put the system on a more sustainable footing and get us out of the recurring crisis that we're in terms of population and capacity. Further measures are needed to buy time to bridge to the point, probably in the spring of 2026, when those new laws start to take effect. So we will, in a few weeks, introduce another one of those measures, the extension of home detention curfew to a 12-month maximum period. And then in the autumn, we will introduce the change that the Lord Chancellor announced yesterday, the changes to recall arrangements, so that those offenders who were sentenced to under 4 years, most of them, if they get recalled, will be automatically re-released 28 days later, and try and reduce the recall population we have in our prisons. But I am very hopeful that the changes that will come about in the sentencing framework will put us on a better footing and get us out of this cycle that we've been in with population and capacity for the last 2 years or more, with a number of acute points when the system was being taken close to the brink of collapse. And that matters for lots of reasons, but one of the reasons it matters is safety in our prisons as well, because prisons operating at that level of pressure, with that level of churn, cannot be as safe as we want them to be. The second thing I just want to touch on briefly is around professional standards and the Rademacher review, which I know you heard from Jennifer a couple of days ago, and Minister Simpson just touched on earlier. I want to be clear as the CEO and on behalf of the whole senior leadership team of HMPPS that we're determined to drive the changes needed and see through those recommendations that we've got. And we want to work closely with the POA and all our recognised trade unions in working out the details of how we implement those recommendations. We're not in a position as the leadership, I'm not in a position as a CEO of being sort of dragged reluctantly into doing something in that area. I'm determined to make the improvements. That's why we set up the Tackling Unacceptable Behaviours Unit several years ago. That's why we commissioned Jennifer Rademacher's review in the first place. And it was HMPPS that commissioned it. And it's why we're determined now to progress the implementation of the recommendations from her review. And I am very grateful for the solid support from the POA and other unions to the initial reception of those recommendations and the principles behind them. Trying to bring about some of these changes together through agreement and cooperation will be a whole lot better than having to try and drive it through in the face of disagreement about those details. I hope that we can secure agreement on the details of how we implement the recommendations in the weeks and months ahead. The last thing I want to say is about pay. I was very pleased that the current government brought forward the timescale last year by getting the remit letter out to the pay review body much earlier than has been the case in recent years. And we're on track for a much earlier outcome than we've had in recent years. The government received the pay review body's report 5 weeks ago. And I'm hopeful that the outcome will be announced by government next week. I'm also hopeful that quite soon afterwards, the next pay round will get underway with an even earlier issuing of the remit letter to the pay review body so that we can get back on track for the 2026 pay award to be even earlier and stick with that in future years. So I want to turn back to safety and focus on that. So I want to be clear about my own position. Violence in our prisons is too high. It's not something that we're taking for granted, that we don't care about, that isn't a priority. I'm determined that we reduce it. I want the working environments of my staff to be safer for them. The last published safety data was very troubling, showing increases in assaults in 2024 compared to 2023. But there were also some signs that it wasn't spiralling out of control in an ever upward trend. We did see a small reduction in the assault rate in the last quarter of 2024 between October and December compared to the previous quarter of July to September. And I'm hopeful that this improvement will be continued into 2025 and that despite all the challenges we currently face, that we start to see an improving trend, including a fall in serious assaults against staff. I wanted to share a few reflections with you about my own background and experiences earlier in my career that have very much shaped my approach, and they inform my leadership now in my current role. Some of this is very historic, but for reasons I'll try and explain, I think it's still very relevant as well. The spine of my early career was in high security prisons. In the early 90s, I was a principal officer in Wakefield. In the late 90s, I was a senior manager in Franklin, and I became the DEP there. And then later on, a few years later, having gone to Dearbolt as governor, as Mark touched on, I went back to Franklin. I was the governor for 4 years. And later on, I became the director of high security. As a prison leader, and with only a few years servicing, I was very deeply affected by the lessons we learned in the mid-1990s. Before, I know some of you were even in the service. For me, they were very formative events, and they've always had an impact on my approach to prison management. In the mid-90s, we had some very high-profile escapes from high-security prisons. From Whitemore in September 1994, which led to the Woodcock inquiry. And then just a few months later, right at the beginning of 1995, escapes from Parkhurst, which led to the Learmont inquiry. I left Wakefield just after the Whitemoor escapes and went to work at headquarters for 12 months. And I was staff officer to Richard Tilt, who became the Director of Security during that period. Wakefield was always a bit different from the other dispersals. It was always run a bit differently and was more controlled. But it was clear that in the mid-90s that the situation was very wrong at the other dispersals. The power dynamic between staff and prisoners was seriously out of kilter. Prisoners had the upper hand. Staff were threatened and intimidated if they tried to do their job properly. Too often, they were not supported by local managers. Indeed, they were often undermined. There was a prevailing management philosophy about how to run long-term high-security prisons in those days. And it seemed to be around the fact that you couldn't really be firm with difficult, dangerous, long-term prisoners. That you had to seek a different sort of accommodation with them compared to the way that you tried to run other prisons. This really was a culture of appeasement. When I was a prison officer at Leeds, I worked lots of shifts with staff on detached duty from Manchester. Joe Simpson, as I said, was one of them. And after the disturbance of 1990 in Manchester, they were often on detached duty going around the estate. And I would hear horror stories from them about what it was like working on detached duty at Frankland and Full Sutton, about the way that prisoners were with staff and the way that staff had retreated. I recall very well talking to one officer who had been very seriously assaulted at Frankland. He'd been assaulted because he went into one of the TV rooms off the landing, and the prisoners told him to leave. And he refused, because he wasn't going to stand for that. And he got very, very badly assaulted. There were no-go areas for staff, and they were brutally enforced by prisoners who had the upper hand. And I can remember when I first went to Franklin in '97, there was an old document lying around that I saw, and it was sort of like a local mission statement. And it had this line in it about the fact that the prison would seek to run a relaxed regime within a secure perimeter. And that was part of the kind of philosophy as well, about how to run those places. But a relaxed regime actually meant a lax regime. There was very poor control. Every step backward that staff took, prisoners took a step forward. That balance of power dynamic, completely wrong, as I said. And poor control inevitably led to poor security. Staff didn't have the confidence to carry out basic security procedures. And it wasn't safe for the odd one who tried to. And managers didn't manage. And I can remember talking to staff at Franklin when I got there in the late 90s, and they were talking about how much it had improved for them. We used to routinely lock down the prison to search it, as well as doing it on an intelligence-led basis if there was a reason to. And they would contrast that with what it had been like a few years before, when trying to lock down the prison for a search was out of the question, because everybody feared a riot. They didn't think it would be tolerated by the prisoners. That is a bit of a contrast with today, despite all the challenges we might have. Because as I speak to you today, Gartree is on the 4th day of its lockdown search. It's been locked down since Monday, because there was a reason to do it, and because people manage and staff carry out basic security procedures, even in long-term prisons. And if you reread the Woodcock reports and the Learmont reports and those inquiries, all of this is laid out. And the folly of a so-called relaxed regime within a secure perimeter was starkly exposed by those escapes from Whitemoor and Parkhurst. Because when it's this bad, a secure perimeter doesn't stop people escaping. Because you need all the other ingredients to be there, and you need control. It's right that today we are worried about drones, and we're worried about the potential that they could convey a firearm into a prison. But more than 30 years ago, in 1994, when 6 Category A prisoners escaped from Whitemoor's Special Security Unit, one of them had a gun and fired that gun, and a prison officer got shot, and fortunately wasn't killed. More than 30 years ago. Now, a determined effort got underway after those escapes and those inquiries to regain control in dispersals, make them safer, make them more secure. And when I was posted to Franklin in 1997, huge progress had been made, and we continue to make more progress. But staff would very much tell me about the bad old days and what it had been like. But they contrasted it because they felt much more in control and confident in what they were doing. Even though, inevitably, they continue to manage very difficult and dangerous people. There was an uncompromising focus on security, and security was a great deal better by that point. And staff were on the front foot, and they pushed the prisoners back and reoccupied the ground that had been surrendered wrongly. That took really strong leadership from the local management team, and it took huge courage from frontline staff to bring about that sort of change. But that's something that was done in that time. There was plenty of resistance, but in the end, the staff prevailed. But despite that, there were always risks to safety, and there continued to be thankfully rare but really serious incidents. When I was the governor, a female officer was attacked by a very dangerous sex offender and sexually assaulted her, and she suffered long-term physical injuries fighting him off. And a few years after I left, there was a terrible incident involving a prisoner called Kevin Thackra, and 2 staff were very nearly killed in the way he attacked them. We have a responsibility to manage all of these risks as effectively as we can, because in our most secure environments, it's not an exaggeration to say that lives are at stake. You know better than me that a prison officer exercises professional judgment all the time in assessing risks to themselves and risk to others. Always trying to anticipate, looking out for the signs of increasing risk so that they can act. Be proactive, be preemptive. Staff rely on each other and on their ability to identify signs of emerging risks in the way a prisoner is behaving, in what other prisoners are saying about them. It's deeply concerning when there's a sense that they can't rely on that ability to spot trouble coming, because people will feel less safe. And I sensed some of that talking to frontline staff at Franklin a few weeks ago who worked in the separation centre there, because no one saw that murderous attack coming from that individual. There wasn't any sign of it in his behaviours. In fact, others on that unit could be more challenging day to day. The way we try to engage with prisoners, build relationships, assess risks from them, I think that holds good for the vast majority of prisoners and for most of the prison estate. But it isn't effective for a small number of people. And if that's the case, we need to be prepared to adapt our approach. If there are a small number of prisoners who aren't prone to violence against staff because of a lack of control, because of poor emotional regulation or poor mental health when they're stressed or angry, then we need to do something different. If it's nothing to do with emotions or mental health, if instead it's a cold, calculated, ideologically driven desire to kill prison staff because they're seen as a legitimate target, then we need a very different approach. both to how we manage those prisoners and how we try to identify them in advance effectively. This raises big questions for us about separation centres and about how we manage some ideologically driven extremists in the estate. The Lord Chancellor will commission the independent review that she's announced, and we will see what's recommended. But it is clear to me that we need to recalibrate and revise our approach. We will look at the recommendations from that independent review in doing so. But the Governor of Franklin will do that in the interim, and his colleagues will across high security. I don't accept that there's any generalised culture of appeasement in the high security estate. I've seen what one looks like about 30 years ago, and that's not where we are today. And that's not a philosophy that leaders have in those prisons or nationally. But we have very different threats today, and we'll need to develop more effective approaches. I'm clear that in any prison, under the Governor's leadership, staff have to be the ones that are in control. If they're not, then it's a whole lot worse in every way. In the wider estate, to improve safety, we need to utilise strategies that respond to changing threats from serious organised crime and from the technologies they use. But we also need to stick with some of the basics, some of the enduring practices that we've developed and learned in days gone by, sometimes having learned painful lessons. So there's a combination of the new and the very familiar in what's needed. Some of it is about basics that remain important. Some of the necessary ingredients that our experience and the evidence would associate with safer prisons can be very difficult to achieve right now in parts of the estate. I recognise that. But I'm determined that we make progress in putting them in place. Here's some of the things I've got in mind. There's a basic thing around staffing, isn't there? You've got to have the right number in the first place. We've made a lot of progress with recruitment and indeed with retention in the last few years. We've got about 1,500 more prison officers in post today than we had 3 years ago. The resignation rate for officers has dropped from well over 13% to well under 10. We need to get the vetting right. We need to get the training right. There are things we're doing to improve all of them, as the Minister touched on. We have to have staff that are confident and capable. Experience is important. One of our challenges is significant levels of inexperienced staff, particularly in some prisons. If we keep resignation rates lower, that will improve over time because we'll keep more people. Staff have to have high standards of professionalism as well as skill and discipline. They need to be skillful in working relationships with prisoners. And the basics around supervision and being alert are also important in what we do day in and day out. The second area is around drugs and the illicit economy. We all know that's at the root of a lot of violence. Serious organised crime has got much more sophisticated, and they are using drones to convey drugs and weapons and phones into prisons. We need to target harden our prisons to that risk. That does require investment. It requires money in the infrastructure of the prisons to make it much more difficult to just deliver packages with drones. We need to invest in some new technologies, and we need to invest in some staffing and intelligence and work with the police to tackle that threat. We have put together a bid for significant investment in all those areas through the current spending review. It is a big priority for me to spend more money on those areas so we can tackle and reduce that threat. Some of the results we've got from Manchester Prison in recent months have been encouraging in being able to see evidence of actually driving down the ingress threat from drones. even without some of the investment that we want in the infrastructure of the prison. The third thing we need is decent conditions. That helps with a safer prison. The crowding and the capacity pressures and the churn of prisons, as I mentioned earlier, are not helpful. The deterioration in living conditions and the fabric of prisons is not helpful. Again, through the spending review, we've saw a significant investment in maintenance in our prisons, and not primarily through the maintenance of the facilities management contracts that Mark touched on before, but major maintenance projects to improve the infrastructure and refurbish and strengthen security in our prisons. The fourth ingredient is around personal activity. We need to occupy people. There needs to be a variety of things that they do in a typical week. The activity needs to be as purposeful as possible. It needs to be rehabilitative for those that are engaging in changing their lives. Some of our safest prisons have the best regimes, places like Oakwood in the private sector, and Stockton and Warren Hill. It needs good leadership at all levels. We need to have an operational grip on the day-to-day, and we need to have strong moral leadership with an emphasis on professional standards in the way that we go about our work. We need to treat prisoners with humanity, but it needs to be a robust humanity. There's nothing soft about it. We have to be uncompromising in insisting on people not behaving badly in an antisocial way. They need to be challenged, and we need to uphold standards. But we also need effective responses to violence when it occurs. I'm very interested in exploring with you and others what it is that we can do to reinvigorate the use of the crime in prison protocol. In some parts of the country, for some prisons with some police forces, it works really well, but it's a bit patchy. And I think the POA have a role in encouraging their members to complete the evidential package for police investigations after violent incidents, as well as managers doing that. And we've seen examples where it's been effective to look to challenge and appeal against the decision not to prosecute. And those decisions have been changed in some cases. But at the next level down as well, we need to consider ways in which we can strengthen our own internal disciplinary system. Ways in which we could strengthen independent adjudicators and the punishments they have available to them. Strengthen the disciplinary penalties that governors have as well for their adjudications. Do more in prisons to publicise the tariffs of punishments so that prisoners are clearly communicated to about the consequences of ill discipline and violence in particular. I've given instructions for us to accelerate the work that's underway to reinvigorate what we're doing with local response teams in high security prisons as well, to improve that capability, which I think is very important. When it comes to different bits of kit and technology, I don't have an ideological position about any of it. I'm pragmatic. I want to look at the evidence of what we think is our best assessment of whether something adds to safety. If that costs money, we will find the money. We will always find the money for the things that we think are needed to try and improve safety. That was what we did when we made a decision to introduce PARVA in the adult estate. It's what we're doing now when we've made a decision to introduce PARVA in the youth estate. Some months, many months before some of the recent high-profile incidents, we carried out a non-operational trial of Taser, working closely with the police and our specialist ORU staff about different types of equipment and what might be effective in a prison setting for different types of incident. And before recent high-profile incidents, we recommended that we then move to an operational trial of Tasers with ORU staff. And ministers agreed to that, as you know, and announced it. I am open to thinking about whether Tasers have a wider role to play beyond ORU staff. It's about the evidence. Similarly, for anti-stab vests, I think there is mixed evidence because of some of the risks that can be associated with the use of those vests, particularly in planned attacks, and because it will cause individuals who are determined to try and kill to go for the face and the neck if there is wide use of anti-stab vests. But there are clearly incidents where wearing such a vest would also offer protection to people. I suspect there are mixed views amongst our staff about the vest, depending on what type of kit is available. They're not necessarily comfortable things to wear for a whole day, particularly in the summer. And lots of other agencies, including the police, who have equipment like that, don't have an assumption that people will be wearing them continuously for 8 or 12 hours. And I know when I visited the Canadian Prison Service some years ago, when they'd introduced them, that they had a big challenge about getting staff to actually wear them consistently through their shifts. But as I said, I'm pragmatic. I want to look at the evidence and let's make a decision. We've got the review around protective body armour underway, as you know, it's been announced. But I do want to come back to the point that safety is fundamental for us. It's foundational to everything else. It's an operational priority for me, and it always will be. And I refuse to accept the status quo. It's not good enough. And I reiterate my determination to reduce violence in our prisons. I sincerely want us to work with the POA to do that, both at the national level, but also critically at local level, where so many of these operational decisions and judgments have to be reached day in and day out. We want the same outcome, so I'm very keen that we work together to achieve it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Phil. You mentioned some really interesting things there. You've just said safety is fundamental. I wish you'd tell that to some of your governors, because these people in front of you don't feel safe. I'm a bit concerned. I know stab-proof and slash-proof vests is divisive amongst staff, but it sounds to me as if you're already setting the stage for your excuses when you fail to roll them out. They're uncomfortable to wear, don't want to wear them for 12 hours. If we put them on, they'll target our face and neck. You know something, Phil? When you work on a building site, you're forced to wear a hard hat. They're uncomfortable. Lots of people don't want to wear them, but it's for their own safety. And you quoted, I think it was the Woodcock report, staff were threatened and intimidated if they tried to do their job properly. That's still going on, but you know who's doing all that? Some of your governors. These people in front of you want to get rid of the weapons, the phones, the drugs from our prisons. They want lockdown searches like what's happening at Gartree. Fantastic, 4 days, let's get it done. It's that bad. I know there's a prison TikTok channel where prisoners live stream from their cells. Our prisons aren't safe, and they'll never be secure until we install drone blocking technology. It's out there. Let's get it done before a weapon comes into our jail that can put these people in a life-threatening situation. And we do appreciate you addressing conference. It's not an easy place to come, especially with what's going on. But I've just got one question for you. With all this, it seems you've learned absolutely nothing from COVID, where violence reduced, self-harm reduced, people felt safe, we were unlocking in smaller cohorts, staff were confident and in control. So there's just one question that these people would want an answer to. Simple, Phil. What's your plan?
Well, two things. In terms of making some of the priority of this and the focus on it clear to governors, that is very clear. That is set out very prominently in a small number of operational priorities that have been set and communicated right across the service, including to every governor. In terms of the plan, the operational priorities document that we circulated at the beginning of the calendar year set out some of the key steps in terms of building on the local reviews of safety strategies and strengthening what we have locally on the ground. But I also wanted to refer to some of the things I said that I think will be relevant, even if they are things that are under consideration at this point, following the government commissioning reviews, or picking up some of the ideas that we're developing to try and improve safety. So we will see what happens with the review in relation to body armour. I wasn't preparing excuses. I was reflecting some of the things that we're learning, that it's not a straightforward thing to just pick up and go with. There are different types of equipment. We need to think about what's most appropriate, and we need to think about the basis on which it might be used. We'll see what that concludes. We'll see what the evidence is around that. If we want to do something, we will find the money to do it. The money will not stand in its way. But I'm also keen that we see what the independent reviewer recommends in relation to separation centres and managing that very small number of people that can be potentially in a very different category, and we might need a very different approach to, compared to the general prison population. And also very open to practical ideas that I touched on about how can we use the Crime in Prisons protocol better, how can we strengthen disciplinary arrangements, both the independent adjudicator and governor in our prisons. Practical ideas like that to try and deal with and have more serious consequences for people when there's ill discipline. But I also think a lot of things turn around whether we have success securing some of the investments that we're seeking to improve counter-drone measures, to improve the infrastructure of our prisons to make them safer and more secure in that way. And if we're able to continue to make progress with our staffing position, having the right number of people, training them better, having ongoing training so they are more experienced, more capable, more confident. If we can make progress with that and make progress against drugs, including against drones, we will have the foundation that enables us to do much better in this area. And that's what I'm really determined that we do.
Well, thank you, Phil. Thank you for your honesty. And as usual, you don't go away empty-handed. I've been to my rock shop. I know you're a Liverpool fan, so I've bought you a bag of Everton mints.